The chopper's rotors sliced through the crisp May air as we approached the drop zone. I'd been on countless missions before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the unusual briefing we'd received back at base, or the uncharacteristic silence that had fallen over Raider Team. As an Army Special Forces soldier, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming that we were heading into something far beyond our usual scope. Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at the center of the cabin, his weathered face a mask of concentration. I'd served under him for years, watched him lead us through hell and back, but even he seemed on edge. "Listen up, Raider," he barked, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "We're dropping into a situation with more unknowns than I'm comfortable with. The official story is a gas leak, but intel's got red flags all over this one." I glanced around at my teammates, each lost in their own thoughts. Chief, our second-in-command, was checking his gear for the 100th time. Doc, our hulking medic from Brooklyn, sat with his eyes closed, no doubt running through scenarios in his head. And Tom caught my eye and gave a half-hearted grin. We'd been through thick and thin together, but something in his expression told me he was as unsettled as I was. As the chopper descended, Blackwood continued the briefing. Small logging town in northeastern Maine. Population of about 2,000. As of 0600 this morning, dozens are either confirmed dead or missing. Local authorities were overwhelmed within hours. That's where we come in. He paused, his eyes sweeping over each of us. I don't need to tell you that this isn't our usual gig. Stay sharp, stay together, and for God's sake, stay alive. The moment our boots hit the ground, the wrongness of the place hit me like a physical force. The town sprawled before us, a patchwork of modest homes and small businesses, but it was the silence that got to me. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, not even the whisper of wind through trees. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. We moved through the empty streets in a tight formation, our training kicking in despite the surreal surroundings. Every so often, we'd come across signs of hasty evacuation. An overturned bicycle here, an abandoned car there. But it was the other details that set my teeth on edge. Blackwood crouched by a lamppost, running his gloved hand over its surface. "Look at this," he muttered, and we gathered around. The metal was pitted and corroded, as if it had been exposed to some kind of powerful acid. As we pushed deeper into town, the damage became more pronounced. Entire sections of buildings seemed to have melted away, leaving behind grotesque, twisted shapes. Doc knelt by one such structure, his face grim behind his protective mask. "Captain," he called out, "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever caused this, it's not like any chemical weapon I know of." The sun was dipping below the horizon by the time we reached the police station, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers. The scene here was even worse. Police cruisers lay scattered about the parking lot, their frames warped and bubbling as if they'd been exposed to intense heat. But it was the smears of dark, viscous liquid on the ground that really set my pulse racing. Inside, the station was a war zone. Desks overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and more of that strange black substance coating the walls in places. Chief let out a low whistle as he examined a series of deep gouges in one wall. "These weren't made by any animal I've ever seen," he said, his usually unflappable demeanor cracking slightly. As night fell in earnest, we set up a temporary command post in what was left of the station's main office. The air was thick with tension as Blackwood laid out our next moves. But before he could finish, a sound cut through the silence, a low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We exchanged glances, each of us recognizing the unmistakable precursor to combat. Whatever had happened to this town, whatever force had turned it into a ghost town in a matter of hours, we were about to come face to face with it. I checked my weapon, the familiar weight offering little comfort against the unknown horrors that awaited us in the darkness. As we moved out into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a nightmare, one from which we might never wake up. The real battle for the quiet town was about to begin, and I had a sinking feeling that all our years of training might not be enough to prepare us for what was coming. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to break over the horizon when we encountered them. I'd seen some messed up shit in my years with special forces, but nothing could have prepared me for this. They came at us in waves. These things that used to be people. Twisted, corrupted versions of the townsfolk, their bodies warped and bulging in ways that defied explanation. The black ooze we'd seen traces of before. It was all over them, pulsing and writhing like it had a mind of its own. I'll never forget the sound they made, a guttural, inhuman shriek that set my teeth on edge. Captain Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and steady as always. Raider, form up. Center mass. Controlled bursts. We fell into formation instinctively, years of training kicking in despite the horror unfolding before us. The first wave hit us hard. These weren't mindless zombies from some B-movie. They moved with a terrifying purpose, coordinating their attacks with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. I caught a glimpse of Tom to my left, his face a mask of determination as he dropped target after target. But for every one we put down, two more seemed to take its place. As we fought our way through the streets towards the KMTH facility, the weight of what we were doing started to sink in. These weren't enemy combatants or terrorists. They were civilians, American citizens who'd been twisted into something inhuman. Every squeeze of the trigger felt like a violation of everything we'd sworn to protect. I saw it in the eyes of my teammates too, the growing horror and revulsion at what we were being forced to do. Chief was the first to spot the cultists. Through the chaos of the fight, we caught glimpses of figures moving with purpose, their faces hidden behind crude deer masks. They seemed to be guiding the infected, using them as cannon fodder while they retreated towards the facility. Captain, Chief called out, gesturing towards the masked figures. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Looks like we found our puppet masters, he growled. Push through to the facility. Whatever's going on, the answers are in there. The KMTA building loomed before us, a stark concrete monolith that seemed to swallow the morning light. As we approached, the attacks intensified. The infected threw themselves at us with renewed frenzy, as if desperate to keep us from breaching the facility's perimeter. Doc went down under a pile of writhing bodies, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought we'd lost him. But then he surged up, his massive frame throwing off the attackers. "I'm good," he shouted, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We were all running on adrenaline and terror at this point. Breaching the facility was like stepping into another world. The sterile corridors were a stark contrast to the chaos outside, but signs of violence were everywhere. Overturned equipment, smashed displays, and always that black ooze smeared across surfaces like some kind of demented graffiti. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach churn. We moved deeper into the complex, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Every room we cleared revealed more questions than answers. Labs filled with equipment I couldn't even begin to understand. Cages that looked like they'd held something. And everywhere, evidence of the cultists. Strange symbols scrawled on walls, discarded deer masks, and in one room, a half-completed ritual circle drawn in what looked disturbingly like blood. It happened so fast. One moment we were moving as a unit, the next we were scattered by an ambush that seemed to come from nowhere. The corridors filled with a noxious gas that had us coughing and disoriented. I lost sight of the others, finding myself alone with Tom in a section of the facility that looked more like a nightmare than a scientific institution. We were backed into a corner, surrounded by infected that seemed to melt out of the shadows. Tom and I fought back to back, our movements in perfect sync after years of working together. But there were too many, and they were getting closer. I heard Tom's cry of pain and turned just in time to see it happen. A splash of that damned black ooze catching him full in the face. The sound Tom made. It'll haunt me for the rest of my days. It was pain and fear and something else, something primal. I watched in horror as the ooze began to spread, Tom's features contorting as he clawed at his own skin. No, 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 I muttered, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. Tom's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw my friend there, struggling against whatever was trying to take control. "Do it," he gasped, his voice barely recognizable. "Don't let me become one of them." My hand shook as I raised my weapon, every instinct screaming against what I knew I had to do. Tom nodded, a final act of understanding between brothers in arms. I squeezed the trigger, the sound of the shot drowned out by the roar of blood in my ears. I don't remember much of what happened next. Somehow, I fought my way back to the others, Tom's last moments replaying in my mind like a broken record. I must have looked like hell, because even Blackwood's stoic facade cracked when he saw me. "Tom," he asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer. I just shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. The loss of Tom hit us all hard, but there was no time to mourn. Whatever was happening in this facility, whatever madness these cultists had unleashed, we had to end it. As we regrouped, preparing to push deeper into the heart of KMT Industries, I made a silent vow. For Tom, for the people of this town, for all of us, we would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The true horror, I realized, was only just beginning. The air grew thicker as Captain Blackwood led us deeper into the bowels of the KMTH facility. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock our every move. We'd face down terrorists, drug cartels, and rogue militias. But this was something else entirely. The weight of Tom's death hung heavy on all of us, a grim reminder of the stakes we were facing. Eyes sharp, Blackwood's voice cut through the silence. "Whatever's behind this clusterfuck, it's down here somewhere." His words were steady, but I could see the strain in his eyes. We'd all seen things today that defied explanation, and the toll was starting to show. We came to a halt in front of a massive steel door, unlike anything else we'd encountered in the facility. Chief ran his hand over the surface, his brow furrowed. "This wasn't in the blueprints, Cap," he muttered. Blackwood nodded grimly. "Looks like we found their little secret. It took all of our combined strength and some creative use of explosives to get that door open." As it groaned apart, a wave of stale, fetid air washed over us. The beam from my tactical light cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that made my blood run cold. We weren't just looking at another level of the facility. This was an entire hidden complex, stretching out beyond the reach of our lights. As we descended into the subterranean level, the true scope of KMT's operation began to reveal itself. The walls were lined with strange, pulsating growths that seemed to writhe at the edge of our vision. Tanks filled with that same black ooze stood in rows, some intact, others shattered and empty. "What the hell were they doing down here?" Doc whispered, his usually booming voice reduced to a nervous hush. Blackwood held up a hand, signaling us to stop. In the distance, we could hear chanting, a low, rhythmic drone that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. "Looks like we're about to crash their little party," he said, his voice grim. We moved forward with practiced stealth, every sense on high alert. The scene that greeted us as we rounded the final corner was like something out of a fever dream. A group of figures in those damn deer masks stood in a circle, swaying in time to their chanting. At the center of their ritual was a mass of the black substance, larger than any we'd seen before. It pulsed and shifted, almost as if it were alive. One of the cultists turned, the blank eyes of his mask locking onto us. For a moment, everything was still. Then all hell broke loose. The cultists scattered, some charging at us with inhuman speed, while others continued their chant with increased fervor. The black mass at the center of the room began to churn and bubble, tendrils of the substance lashing out like whips. The firefight that ensued was unlike anything I'd experienced in all my years of service. Our bullets seemed to have little effect on the cultists, who moved with a speed and strength that no human should possess. The air was thick with gun smoke and the acrid smell of the black ooze, which seemed to be everywhere at once. In the chaos, I lost track of the others. Gunfire and shouts echoed off the walls, mixed with the inhuman shrieks of the cultists and the constant, maddening chant that never seemed to stop. I found myself face to face with one of the masked figures, its blank eyes somehow radiating a mixture of madness and ecstasy. As we grappled, its mask slipped, revealing a face that was barely human anymore, twisted and malformed by exposure to the black substance. A scream cut through the din. Doc's voice, filled with pain and fear. I turned to see him on the ground, a tendril of the black ooze wrapped around his leg. Chief was there in an instant, hacking at the substance with his combat knife. But even as he freed Doc, I could see the telltale signs of infection beginning to spread. Fall back. Blackwood's voice rang out, clear and authoritative, even in the midst of the madness. We retreated, dragging Doc with us, to a more defensible position near the entrance. As we regrouped, the full weight of our situation began to sink in. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy we barely understood. Doc's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The black substance had spread up his leg, and I could see the struggle in his eyes as he fought against its influence. "You know what you have to do," he gritted out, looking at each of us in turn. The same thought was written on all our faces. We couldn't let him become one of those things. Not like Tom. It was Chief who stepped forward, his face a mask of grim determination. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "You've patched us up more times than I can count, Doc. Let me do this for you." Doc managed a weak smile, clasping Chief's hand in gratitude. The rest of us turned away, unable to watch. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the corridor, final and devastating. In the aftermath of Doc's death, a heavy silence fell over us. We'd lost two of our own in a matter of hours to an enemy we could barely comprehend. Blackwood's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and filled with a cold fury I'd never heard from him before. "We end this. Now, whatever that thing is in there, whatever these cultists are trying to do, we shut it down. For Tom, for Doc, for everyone in that town up there." As we prepared for our final push, I found myself next to Blackwood. For a moment, the hardened exterior cracked, and I saw the weight of command bearing down on him. "You ever wonder if we're in over our heads?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me since we first set foot in this town. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "Every damn day," he finally replied. "But that's the job. We go where others can't, or won't. Whatever's waiting for us in there, we're the only ones standing between it and the rest of the world." He turned to me, his gaze steely with resolve. "You with me?" I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. We'd seen horrors today that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. We'd lost friends, brothers in arms. But we were still here, still fighting. And as long as we drew breath, we'd keep pushing forward, into the heart of the nightmare, to face whatever madness awaited us. For Tom, for Doc, for all of us. As we moved out, back towards the chamber where the cultists had been performing their ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far bigger than any of us could imagine. The chanting had stopped, but in its place was a low, pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Whatever was waiting for us in that room, it was awake now, and it was hungry. The air seemed to thicken with each step we took back towards the ritual chamber. Blackwood led the way, his movements sharp and focused, a man on a mission. Chief and I flanked him, our formation tight despite the gaping absences where Tom and Doc should have been. The loss of half our team in the span of a few hours was a wound that throbbed with every heartbeat, but we pushed on. We had to. As we approached the chamber, the pulsing hum grew louder, vibrating through the soles of our boots and rattling our teeth. The door hung open, torn from its hinges by some immense force. Blackwood held up a closed fist, bringing us to a halt. On my signal, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ominous drone. We burst into the room, weapons at the ready, only to find a scene of utter chaos. The black mass at the center had grown, consuming most of the chamber floor. Tendrils of the substance whipped through the air, slamming into walls and equipment with devastating force. The cultists were scattered about, some still chanting in a frenzied state, others writhing on the ground as the black ooze consumed them. Jesus Christ, Chief muttered, his normally stoic demeanor cracking at the sight before us. One of the cultists turned towards us, his deer mask half melted into his face. You cannot stop it, he croaked, his voice a mixture of ecstasy and agony. The convergence has begun. Blackwood didn't hesitate. His rifle barked, and the cultist dropped. Fan out, he ordered. Find a way to shut this thing down. We spread out, skirting the edges of the pulsating mass, searching for anything that looked like a control system or a power source. I found myself near what appeared to be a makeshift altar, covered in strange symbols and smeared with blood. A book lay open, its pages filled with diagrams and text in a language I didn't recognize. As I reached for it, a tendril of the black substance lashed out, nearly taking my hand off. I stumbled back, firing instinctively into the mass. The bullets seemed to be swallowed up, having no visible effect. Over here, Chief's voice cut through the chaos. He was standing in front of a bank of computers, their screens flickering with streams of data. Looks like some kind of containment system. It's offline. Blackwood was there in an instant, his eyes scanning the readouts. Can you get it back up? He asked, ducking as a piece of equipment went flying overhead, torn loose by the thrashing tendrils. Chief's fingers flew over the keyboard. Negative, he growled after a moment. Whatever they did, it fried the whole system. We'd need a team of engineers and about a week to get this back online. I saw the change come over Blackwood's face, the moment when a new plan formed. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small cylindrical object, a thermite grenade. If we can't contain it, he said, his voice grim, we burn it out. The plan came together quickly. Chief would create a diversion, drawing the attention of the writhing mass. I'd cover Blackwood as he made his way to the center, where the substance seemed to be most concentrated. It was a long shot, but it was the only play we had left. Everything happened in a blur of motion and sound. Chief let loose with his grenade launcher, the explosions sending shockwaves through the chamber. The black mass reacted violently, tendrils lashing out in all directions. I fired in controlled bursts, taking down cultists who tried to intervene and targeting the larger tentacles that threatened to engulf Blackwood. Time seemed to slow as Blackwood reached the center. I saw him pull the pin on the thermite grenade, his arm drawing back for the throw. In that moment, a massive tendril rose up behind him, poised to strike. Captain, I shouted, my voice lost in the cacophony. Blackwood turned, saw the threat, and made a split-second decision. Instead of throwing the grenade, he held onto it, allowing the tendril to wrap around him. No, I heard Chief's anguished cry, but it was too late. Blackwood and the grenade were pulled into the heart of the black mass. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world exploded into white-hot light. The thermite ignited, and the chamber became an inferno. The black substance shrieked, an otherworldly sound that threatened to shatter my sanity. Chief and I threw ourselves behind a fallen chunk of concrete, the heat searing the air from our lungs. I don't know how long we huddled there, the world burning around us. When the roar of the flames finally died down, we emerged to find the chamber transformed. Where the pulsating black mass had been, there was now only scorched earth and twisted metal. Of Blackwood and the cultists, there was no sign. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on me. We'd started this mission as a team of 5, and now it was just Chief and me. I looked over at him, saw the same shell-shocked expression I knew must be on my face. "We need to move," Chief said after a long moment, his voice hoarse. "This place could come down any minute." I nodded, unable to find words. We made our way out of the facility in a daze, each step taking us further from the nightmare we'd endured, but unable to shake the feeling that we were leaving a part of ourselves behind. The sun was setting as we emerged from the K&T building, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. It seemed wrong somehow that the world could look so beautiful after all the horror we'd witnessed. The town was quiet now, no sign of the infected that had swarmed us earlier. Whatever Blackwood had done down there, it seemed to have ended the immediate threat. We were halfway to our extraction point when we saw him, a lone figure in a navy blue suit, walking towards us with purposeful strides. Chief and I raised our weapons instinctively, but the man held up his hands in a placating gesture. "At ease, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "My name is Dominic. I'm here to debrief you on the events of the past 24 hours. I exchanged a glance with Chief, confusion and suspicion warring in my mind. "Debrief us?" I asked. "Who the hell are you with?" Dominic's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I represent a group that deals with anomaly problems like the one you just encountered. You've done your country a great service today, even if the world will never know it." As Dominic began to explain the broader context of what we'd faced, a shadow war against paranormal threats that had been raging for decades, I felt my worldview shifting. Everything I thought I knew about reality, about the enemies we faced, and the world we were protecting, was being turned on its head. In that moment, standing in the fading light with the weight of our losses heavy on our shoulders, I realized that our fight against the horrors in that facility was just the beginning. There was a larger war being waged in the shadows, one that would require soldiers like us to stand on the front lines. And despite everything we'd lost, everything we'd suffered, I knew that Chief and I would answer that call. For Blackwood, for Tom, for Doc, and for a world that would never know how close it had come to the brink of annihilation. As Dominic finished his explanation, he looked at us expectantly. "So, gentlemen," he said, "are you ready to join the real fight?" Chief and I shared a look, years of partnership allowing us to communicate without words. We'd seen the face of true evil today, stared into an abyss that threatened to consume everything. And we'd survived. Whatever came next, whatever horrors awaited us in this hidden war, we would face them together. I turned back to Dominic, my resolve hardening. "Where do we start?"